Bash build after patch, no problem. Whether you've been playing the Bash Barb or not, I wanted to make an updated video to our Endgame Bash build with Hota that we did previously on the channel. If you've been running Bash, you know this build is capable of doing hundreds of millions of damage per hit, and in my opinion is the best Barb build out currently. Now if we're talking about pure DPS, some of the Bash bleed variants can do a lot more damage, even up into the Barbillions. This is the best Bash Barbarian in the game, and the best setup for you for one main reason. It's easy to set up and fun to play, and easily beating any Uber boss in the game. This build simply conquers everything. You can get this thing online in under 24 hours from level 0 if you really push. And you can speedrun all of this content without holy bolts. Obviously, we're seeing a little bit of that nerf. But that being said, I'll go over everything the build entails real quick. And in the description, there is a build link to the official in-game Hota Bash build. It'll be the first link in the description and the pinned comment, so make sure to check that out if you want to demolish all the in-game content. Now first we'll go over the skills, and like I mentioned earlier, the bleed bash build and some other ones may do some more DPS to push higher pit tiers, but really there's no need currently in the game to push up into the 140s and 150s unless you just really want to, because farming is perfectly efficient at lower levels such as 100 or 101. That being said, obviously we're going to take Bash, our primary damage dealer, and I'm going to show you the rotation and make sure that every single thing you do is dealing the most damage, because a lot of people actually don't know the primary rotation for this build in terms of the skills that you should hit in the order you should actually hit them. So obviously we're going to take 3 out of 3 on Bash here. Now the biggest thing, obviously, if you've not played this build, is combat Bash. So once you critically strike 4 times with Bash, it's going to build up essentially a meter down here on your skill bar. It should look just like this, where it shows 4 stacks of Bash. That means your next skill is ready to overpower. Now in our skill tree, we're also going to take Hammer of the Ancients. We're going to take that into Violent Hammer of the Ancients, so that way after overpowering, you deal 30% more multiplicative damage for 5 seconds. Now this is the big primary buff on this build, because as we mentioned, once you see that 4 stack of overpower down here on your skill bar, that means your next skill will overpower. That means once that happens and we hit that 4 stack, we then want to use Violent Hammer of the Ancients here, and it's going to up our damage 30% for 5 seconds, giving us a lot more damage and a lot harder bash hits. So that's basically how the Hota variant works. We don't use Hota for damage, we use it for the 30% extra damage buff. Now coming down here, you also want to take Rallying Cry into Strategic Rallying Cry to up our Fortify. Then we want to go down here and do 1 out of 3 for Outburst and Tough as Nails. This just simply procs Thorns when enemies hit us to make the enemies bleed. So we get to take advantage of DR from bleeding enemies, etc. We want to take Max Imposing Presence for additional health and Martial Vigor for additional damage reduction from elites. Then 1 out of 5 for Challenging Shout into Enhance, so that way we get 20% bonus life and the actual DR from Challenging Shout itself. And then War Cry for additional damage. This is going to be one of our big damage scalers. It's going to grant us Berserking for 4 seconds, and then it's also going to give us Power War Cry, so we get additional damage when multiple enemies are nearby, helping us to clear the pit levels much faster. And we also want Booming Voice for the shout skill duration and Aggressive Resistance for additional damage reduction. Now we're also going to take Pit Fighter, Slaying Strike, and No Mercy. No Mercy helping us for our crit strike chance against a lot of the enemies. We can immobilize, stun, or slow. And then 1 out of 3 for Hamstring, so we can slow healthy enemies, meaning initially we get that critical strike chance buff right off the bat. We also want Steel Grasp, Enhanced Steel Grasp, and Fighter Steel Grasp. This is going to give us Berserking each time it damages an enemy, allowing us to upkeep our Berserking, and then also make them vulnerable, allowing us to again max out our damage on enemies through that vulnerable state. And then Counteroffensive, so you deal more damage while fortified. And then finally down here, the passive's Heavy-Handed, so your 2-handed weapons deal increased critical strike damage. 3 out of 3 for Wallop, so you deal more damage. And then honestly here I went for Brute Force, so your overpowers deal additional damage with a 2-handed weapon, given that we hit pretty big overpowers with Bash. Now if you want, you can take something like Swiftness just to up our movement speed to help clear speed. And then we want to take Unconstrained, so we increase that Berserking's max duration and its damage, again buffing our overall damage across the board. And now I want to go over the gear really quick. Now there are a couple substitutions you can make without the Uber Uniques that will again be in the build link in the description, as well as all the stats for all the gear and everything. But the ideal setup you want here is your Harlequin Crest. This is going to be one of the biggest pieces you can get, because it gives you 20% flat damage reduction non-stop, and it also gives you +4 ranks to all our skills. This being all of our skills like War Cry, enhancing our damage, Rallying Cry, every single thing, Challenging Shout. The big one being our Bash skill, because if we take 4 points out of Bash, you can see if we move, our damage goes down to 60,000 maximum. But then if we put 4 points back in, it's going to go up to 86,000. That is a huge % damage increase once it multiplies to all of your other skills. And then also primarily your masterworking stat. You want to try and stack all of your masterworking on cooldown reduction so you can reduce the cooldown of all of our shouts down here. And then for our chest, you want the undying aspect. Now there's two things you can specifically do with your chest. Ideally, I went for imposing presence and steel grasp stuns enemies for 1.7 seconds, so we get additional stun from steel grasp, allowing us to proc a little bit more damage and keep enemies from hitting us consistently. And if you cast steel grasp on them over and over, it stuns them over and over, meaning it keeps you alive much easier and it's harder for you to die. And tempered imposing presence for the additional health, but we also want a resistance type we don't have on our chest to max out our resistances, as well as going for max life and strength. Now for your chest, you can also use Tyros Might because we get a big buff here, as you can see, of up to 100% for the Divine Barrage. And again, it's going to help out maxing out our resistances overall, and you don't miss much specifically from the actual chest itself besides the undying aspect. Besides undying, we're not really missing so much with our chest, so if you decide to use Tyros Might, you could definitely use this in place of the chest, again, if you have it, and I think it's going to be a good addition to the build. And then we want Paygorger's Gauntlets, so once we use Steel Grasp on enemies and pull them in, we're marking them all and then spreading that damage across all of them. Now that big damage percentage you see at the bottom, 180%, that's a big number if you're looking to clear pits quicker. The other big thing is critical strike chance and attack speed. If you get a GA on either of those, great, but you want to make sure primarily you're focusing your masterworking on your critical strike chance specifically. Currently, I'm running through every piece of content in the game, and I only have, let's see, 42.9%. If you get this over 70%, you're just mauling everything nonstop. So next for our pants, we're going to want the aspect of might. So our basic skills grant 20% DR. This is great because we're always going to be proccing that DR. Ideally, you could take +3 to concussion here. We already get stun from some of our other things like our steel grasp and the buff here. So you can also do things like stun duration increase, so we stun enemies longer, or just crowd control duration. So either of those options would be perfectly fine. And then the main thing here, we want ranks to our bash skill. Now there's actually a little bit of a secret here. If you don't have pants with a greater affix to bash, you can still upgrade your bash very high and upgrade your damage almost instantly using this little trick. We also want challenging shout cooldown reduction on our pants. This will help us keep our challenging shout up for DR pretty non-stop. Now the trick with bash is obviously you want to get a max roll. So you want to try and get a +3 to bash just on the principle of the basic pants. Now the trick here when masterworking is to masterwork your bash specifically all the way up to level 2, but on your first big 25% boost to your affix, you need to make sure that it hits bash. If you make sure that that 25% bonus hits your pants one time specifically, at least on the first roll, so reset it as many times as you need. By the time you get to 9 out of 12, you'll have a +5 to bash instead of your original +3. Now, if you actually hit this 2 times, by the time you upgrade this thing to like 10, 11, or 12 masterworking, if you happen to hit that 25% boost again 2 times, you'll have a +6 to bash, meaning you'll be doing even more damage. So that's the trick you want to follow when masterworking your pants, so that way you can get the most damage out of your bash skill. Now for our boots, we want armor here. Ideally, once you upgrade this enough, you're going to be able to help max out your armor cap past that 9,200 and something mark. You also want movement speed to help us clear much quicker, and then also an additional resistance here. If we're using Tyros Might, that might be a little different, and we can change that up. That'll be on the other build planner with all of the Ubers in the description again. But for now, we want the extra resistance we don't have on our gems over here on our boots. Also, we want crowd control, duration, and movement speed, and the masterwork movement speed up top. And then for our two-handed mace, we just want strength, max life, and critical strike damage. The GA on crit strike damage is really good. Also, we want tempered damage to close enemies and bash cleave. The big thing here is you need to make sure you're hitting your bash cleave on the first masterworking level from levels 1 to 2 to get that big 25% bump. And then if you get lucky after that, like I did, you do more and more damage. This is the main damage scaler on our actual gear, so you need to make sure you focus on that and reset masterworking ranks if you don't get that on level 1 until you finally get it. Now we're also going to use Aspect of the Moonrise here. Again, this is what helps scale our basic skill damage. You can see we gain 160% basic skill damage and movement speed for 10 seconds when we actually enter that vampiric blood rage, and you get 4% or 20% stacked attack speed from using your basic skills. And then Edge Masters on our sword, and then Inner Calm on our other sword. Now for both swords, you want strength, max life, and crit strike damage, and also damage while berserking on both the swords, as well as again bash cleave for scaling our damage. And you can see again I have masterwork other stats outside of bash cleave. You want your bash cleave stat masterworked to up our damage the most. And then we want Edge Masters on one sword, so we deal more increased damage per primary resource we have, and we're going to be stacking max resource with this build because we don't use any fury, so we'll constantly get this bonus. And then the Aspect of Inner Calm. Now with the damage while berserking, the main reason you want damage while berserking, if I show you here in our abilities and Paragon Board, the way this works is because there's a glyph here specifically that I'll go over in a minute called the Blood Rage Board. Now this board, once maxed out, gives you 30% additional multiplicative damage. Now in order to hit this, you have have to have 300% damage while berserking to actually max out this bonus and get that additional 30% bonus. So you can see here, if we look at our stats, we go to stats and materials. And then if we go to damage while berserking, we have 279%, almost maxed out to that 300%. This basically rounds to 28% in that case, which is why we get 28% extra damage. That's why we're trying to max it out here. And once you upgrade these to 3 out of 3, you'll have your damage while berserking maxed out without an issue. Now for our two-handed sword, we want critical strike damage, max life, and strength again. GA on crit strike damage is also really good. Again, close enemies and bash damage for our tempers. Then our rapid aspect, so our basic skills get 60% additional attack speed, allowing us to output more damage. And for all of these weapons, we actually want topazes in all of them to up our basic damage. Now for our ring, I like steel grasp cooldown reduction as well as damage to close enemies, and then resistance to all elements, attack speed, and strength. Ideally, we can swap out eventually the strength and resistance to all elements for crit strike chance once you can, because right now I'm just trying to hit my resistance goals. Crit strike chance you definitely want on your ring. And for our aspect for our ring, we want the aspect of elements. And then you can see this ring, we have strength, attack speed, and crit strike chance with war cry cooldown reduction and damage to close enemies. And then we want bold chieftain's aspect here to reduce our shout cooldowns. Also, we want to make sure we hit crit strike chance on this ring with our masterworking. And then on our amulet, we want crit strike chance, cooldown reduction, and attack speed. Now I have fury on kill right now. That's just what I happen to have. But also we have challenging shout cooldown. If you're struggling with DR or trying to stay alive, if you are perfectly fine with your health and DR and everything else, you can actually swap this over to war cry. Again, allowing us to keep our war cry up much easier and damage to close enemies as well. And then for our amulet, we're using the aspect of adaptability, so that when we cast a skill at above 50% max resource, which is maxed out all the time, our basic skills deal that 120% extra damage. And we slotted the additional gems here for the elements and resistances we need, so that way we're making sure we're maxing those out. And next for our expertise, we want the 200x expertise for increasing damage to vulnerable enemies. Now that's the gear. Let me go over the Paragon board really quickly, and it's the same Paragon I did in a previous video or the previous in-game build. You get the max life nodes down here. For basic glyph, we're going to be taking the exploit glyph, so we make enemies vulnerable right off the bat and up our damage to vulnerable enemies. Then you want to come up here and take the Warbringer board. Again, once we come over here, we're going to slot the territorial glyph. This gives us more damage to enemies and damage reduction against close enemies. And you want to make sure you take this resistance to all elements node, giving you a bunch of extra resistance. And if you struggle with them, you can also reallocate a couple points and take these resistance nodes as well if needed. Then we want to make sure we take the maximum fury and max life nodes up here to buff our max life. Then for our next board, we're going to want to come over here to the Carnage board. Now the Carnage node itself, while berserking, gives us critical strikes, increase your attack speed up to 16%, again helping us to do overall quicker and more damage. For our glyph here, we want to slot the Ire glyph to up our damage while berserking, again to meet that big berserking requirement that we get big damage bonuses for. And then we also want to take the damage reduction from close enemies all the way over here, and the damage while berserking right here as well. Then for our next board, we're actually going to want to come up here for our fourth board. It's important you make this for your fourth board so you get all the buffs, is the Blood Rage board. Again, I explained that earlier. We want to make sure we hit that 30% berserking damage buff via that percentage below, meaning we have 300% max damage while berserking at least to max that out. Then for our glyph, we want to take the Martial glyph. We get damage to bleeding enemies and damage reduction from bleeding enemies. And this makes it so after casting a shout skill, it actually reduces our other non-shout skills by 2 seconds, meaning specifically our Steel Grasp is the main one, allowing us to keep that up pretty consistently and cast it whenever we need. And then also we want to take the nodes here for damage to bleeding enemies, damage reduction, the max life nodes up here, and again our damage while berserking. So our next board, or our fifth board, is going to be this one down here. It's going to be the Hemorrhage board. We want to slot the Might glyph. This gives us bonus to all the nodes around and also gives us 8% increased damage while wielding 200 weapons. We also get the damage reduction here and the physical damage over time and strength there. Our next board, or our sixth board, is going to be slotted with the Undaunted glyph. Now this is another thing and a big one you want to pay attention to proccing, because once you select this node, each time you make an enemy vulnerable, you get a 10% increase in your damage for 5 seconds. And if you overpower that vulnerable enemy, you get an additional 10% buff. Now the big thing here is we're going to be overpowering using our bash 4 times, using that to then use Hota, which will overpower and hit the enemy and gives us that 30% damage buff. And then again, by overpowering that enemy here, you get 20% additional bonus on our damage. So you also want to slot the Undaunted glyph in here. This is going to give us additional damage while fortified and also up to 10% damage reduction for just having fortify. And then we get the damage reduction from vulnerable enemies here, extra physical damage and max life, and then again more max life on these nodes. And then for our 7th board, we're going to want to take the Bone Breaker board, and we just want to take these stats down here, or these nodes for max life, to again up our max life by quite a bit right off the bat. Now we're going to touch on the rotation really quick, because there are a couple little nuances of things you need to do. So obviously we're just going to cast our Rallying Cry essentially whenever it's up, giving us unstoppable movement speed and resource generation just to get our initial bump of fury all the way up max to 120. And then again, we're going to use this continually as we go throughout the fight. Same for Challenging Shout, but we're just going to use Challenging Shout for additional max life and the big DR buff whenever we feel like we need it. Now the primary damage rotation is as follows. So you can see we're going to be using our two-handed mace specific. That's going to be what allows us to overpower with Hota. So you can see as I continue to hit this dummy, I deal pretty easily into the millions of damage, but the big buffs really come in once you start seeing your 4 here. So you can see this 4 stack here for Bash tells us now that we're going to be able to overpower a weapon mastery or core skill. Now the core skill, again, we're going to want to overpower is Hota because it gives us that 30% damage buff. So you can see once we get 4 stacks right here, essentially we're then going to cast Hota, and then we're going to cast Warcry to get that additional damage. So that way it grants us Berserking for 4 seconds. And then Berserking, as we know, grants us 25% increased damage. So you can see here, once we cast Warcry and we zoom in this area right here around us, you can see we're kind of on fire. That means we're currently in Berserking, meaning we get our movement and all of our damage buffs this way through actual Berserking, as well as the extra Berserking damage down here that we get through the Unconstrained passive, again helping us to buff our damage even more. Now we're also going to be using our Steel Grasp here to use chains on enemies and again make them vulnerable, as you can see, and it's going to make them vulnerable for 3 seconds, allowing us to just go to town, as well as also give us Berserking when we use this as well. And you can see with the combination we're able to stack the Berserking buff pretty non-stop for extra damage. Now the rotation is continue to bash, and as you bash and get critical strikes, we then get the overpower at 4 here. We're then going to jump right into Hota. Since our Hota damage buff is 5 seconds and our Warcry damage is 4 seconds, this is why you want to cast Warcry last and not first. So we want to just continue to bash until we get that 4 stack right here. We then want to cast Hota and Warcry directly after. Use our change and then start to bash again. So you can see we got 4 stacks here. Hota, Warcry, chains, continue to bash, and now we're hitting in the hundreds of millions easily with crit strikes, which again is why your crit strike chance is so important. If you can get it up into the 70s or 80s, you can be hitting 100 millions over and over and over again. Now one nuanced thing and why you want to make sure you're running it this way is because your bash skill can actually overpower weapon mastery skills as well, and your Steel Grasp is a weapon mastery skill. So let's say we're bashing here, let's say we're bashing and getting these stacks up. If you use your Steel Grasp first, it's actually going to overpower this Steel Grasp skill and not Hota. So not only do you waste your overpower on Steel Grasp, but also when you do Hota, it does absolutely nothing. And then your Warcry after you cast it is basically wasted because your big buff from Hota is essentially gone, which is why we need to do Bash, Hota, Warcry, and then chains, and then bash again. And once you get to this first initial rotation, after about 5 seconds of bashing, you're going to want to cast chains again so you can continue to hit the enemy while they're vulnerable. And then by the next go around, you should be up with pretty much all of your abilities back. So again, we're going to use bash. So again, once we get 4 stacks, we're going to Hota, Warcry, chains, go back to hitting, and then here's where we hit in the hundreds of millions. Now if you see when we cast Hota, there's a green bar down there. Essentially, once that green bar is all the way down to 0, you're then going to want to cast your chains again and continue to hit while everything refreshes. So let's do this full through one time. We're going to continue to bash until we get max stacks. Hota, Warcry, chains, continue to bash. We're watching that Hota down there. It went all the way down. We're going to chains again. We're going to continue to bash. And we have 4 stacks again. So we're just going to continue with this rotation. Hota, Warcry, chains, hundreds of millions, 147 million. Our things down, chains, continue to go. We should get the refresh here pretty soon on our Warcry, and then we're going to go back into it. That is the full build rotation, and this build is extremely good still to this moment. The build is so good, so make sure to check that out in the description. Like the video if you haven't already, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.